Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. With more than 100 interviews under my belt now, it becomes more and more difficult to find unique ways to describe the brilliance of a new book that comes across my desk. Words like inspired, nuanced, thought-provoking, intelligent, and remarkable might go some way to help you understand how much I loved my next guest's book. Tania Farrelly is an award-winning advertising strategist who spent the last 25 years working at Australia's leading advertising agencies. In recent times, she has established her own brand consultancy and even more recently turned her attention from telling brand stories to human stories through her creative writing. Her debut novel, The Eighth Wonder, published by Penguin, will land on bookshelves across Australia in early July. And I am thrilled to be chatting with Tania about this divine story on the podcast today. Welcome, Tania.
Thanks, Claudine. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, it's so wonderful to have you. Congratulations on this stunning book. I am in absolute awe of your magnificent achievement. Has it hit you yet that this book is going to be out in the world from Friday?
It has not hit me at all. Seems like I've had the longest gestation period of any novelist ever, but I'm gradually, like, even the fact that you've read it is staggering, thrills me, and I forget all the time because I'm so used to living with it. And so it's going to be really exciting to see it in the stores finally.
Oh, that's so wonderful. As you can tell from my introduction, Tania, I thoroughly enjoyed this beautiful book and the journey it took me on through New York in the early 19th century. A fascinating era by any account. Can you tell me about the spark of inspiration that sent you in search of Rose and Ethan's story?
Yes, I can definitely do that. It was a moment of serendipity, actually. And just to give you a little bit of backstory, my dad is a physics teacher, an ex-physics teacher. And so his great hero is Albert Einstein. And he also talked all the time about Tesla and Edison. And I was watching and I've been fascinated by American history all my life. And I was watching actually a documentary about Edison and Tesla and their war. And I came across a piece of flickering footage, completely unprepared for this footage, of an elephant being tethered up in Coney Island in 1903. And it was actually some of the earliest footage ever around, because Edison invented the cinematography. And this poor elephant was standing there on a snowy January day and lifting her feet obediently on the word up to have these copper-soled sandals applied to her feet, not knowing that in a few minutes that she would actually be no longer with us. And that footage is around still. I actually never watched her demise. I couldn't bear it, but it broke my heart. And I thought I would really love to do for someone to have stepped up and intervened. I researched what led to the whole episode with Topsy the elephant, and it sort of threw me down this rabbit hole of Gilded Age New York and the brilliance of it, with the characters like Edison and Tesla and Twain and Pulitzer and Hearst, you name it, they were all there walking the streets. And I was sort of sucked into that whole environment where at one end of New York, up at Fifth Avenue, there was incredible wealth, unbelievable wealth. And at the other end, there was this dreadful poverty. And in between was a bunch of women who ran the settlement houses to help the poor and to help raise up their levels of education, their access to healthcare. And out of that grew this idea for Rose Kingsbury Smith, who is the heroine of the novel. And obviously out of the idea of Topsy and my elephant Daisy, who you would have read about, grew the idea for Ethan Salt, who is the hero of the story. So that's how it all began. And it was really then a good long deep dive into the Gilded Age era of Manhattan, which is 1870 to 1910. And all of the characters just literally started to jump out of the pages of the textbooks and the movies and all the documentaries, etc., etc.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating and so well done, Tania. So for those who haven't read the book yet, can you tell me a little bit more about the story?
Yes, the story really follows the progress of a young woman, and it's through her eyes that we experience Gilded Age New York. Rose Kingsbury Smith is the heroine, and she's born into a very privileged background where she is expected to marry a man of good means. But Rose has been influenced over the years by a number of things, not the least of which was Emily Roebling's achievement in engineering the Brooklyn Bridge. So as a little girl and a bit of a misfit, she decides she wants to follow in Emily's footsteps and become an architect. So she's in a precarious situation because she wants to push back on the customs of the day. But the expectation is that she will marry, essentially without going into plot situations. She is almost railroaded into a relationship, and she has to make some fairly tough decisions to go her own way and to really stand up for her own independence. And it's in doing that that she becomes a voice of many other women and champions the values of independence as a young feminist in this Gilded Age society. And it's only when she meets a lowly circus man who's an ex-circus man who's living on Coney Island, caring for his beloved elephant Daisy and trying to rescue animals who've been brutalised by the circus industry. It's only in meeting him that she starts to reconsider her own view of her own legacy and what she would like to leave the world down the track.
This book certainly provided fodder for thought for me, particularly since you touch on so many great themes that are as relevant today, I think, as they were back then. But I guess the thing that struck me most about this book, perhaps like many of the historical fiction books that we're lucky to enjoy in recent times, is the strength and determination and also the forward-thinking qualities of your central character, Rose Kingsbury Smith. So I wanted to ask you if you could tell me about your inspiration for Rose, and was she modelled on real-life characters?
She was. So that's a great question. I suppose when you're trying to create a story about that's really true and authentic to the time, you have to look at the women that existed then. And there was a real multi-layered, I suppose, multi-strated approach to women. So again, at one end of New York, as it happened around the whole world, there was the lower class, the immigrants, and you had women coming out of the slums, I suppose, who were in the manufacturing business, seamstresses mainly, and that's where the term sweatshops were born. But a lot of them stood up and became unionists. So there was a degree to which I wanted Rose to have an element of that to her, to be able to stand up for lower class women. But I also wanted her to be an ambitious person and to not let, I guess, patriarchy or misogyny get in the way of her progress. And there was actually a woman called Julia Morgan she was America's first female architect. She was the first woman ever to be accepted into L'École, I can't say it in French, but L'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which was where all of the world's classic architects were born and made. And Julia was actually from California, from San Francisco. She always loved maths and science, and unlike Rose, had a very supportive mother. And she found herself getting an engineering degree at Berkeley when there was no other engineering students. And she found a tutor, someone that really looked after her and suggested that she try for a position in Paris to become a fully fledged architect. She actually sat all the exams in Paris were set in French and all in the metric system, which Julia was not used to. And she had to sit her exam 3 times. Each time she actually passed, but she didn't hit the top 30 that she needed to get into. And on the third time, the second time she actually got into the top 30, but the men decided that they didn't want to encourage women, so they didn't let her in. And then the third time, she was right up there in the top sort of 20, and they couldn't say no to her. So Julia then became an architect in her own right in San Francisco. There's a whole backstory to her as well, which would make fascinating reading for anyone that's interested. But she ended up designing the very famous Hearst Castle in San Simeon for William Hearst, the newspaper mogul. And she ran her business until she was into her 70s, never married, never had kids, but that was her life's passion. And she really paved the way for a whole bunch of women to follow her into engineering and architecture and all the things that men didn't believe women had the brains to do. Rose is modelled a little bit on Julia and Julia's determination, and a little bit on people that were like the Lillian Wards and the Florence Kellys, who I've also made cameo appearances in the story, to create this kind of woman with power and a drive to succeed against the odds that were there.
I guess on this point, the narrative of your story, as you've already mentioned, is peppered with appearances from real life characters, people like JP Morgan and Richard Croker, Florence Kelly, and as you've mentioned, Lillian Ward, just to name a few, people who represented the contradictions that existed in New York society. Did you consciously set out to explore the extremes of society at that time, or was this more an organic development for you?
I suppose initially, no. I wanted to set a record straight for the animals. That's where it started. And as I mentioned, as I flew down that rabbit hole, I found incredible contradictions in terms of once women got married, they lost all of their rights. So they were chattels, just like the family dog. They lost their ability to have their own money, to go to work, things like that. This is in the upper class. And so, straight away that sort of contradiction hits you in the face. And as I was investigating the period and looking at the top end of town, it struck me that just 1 mile south, you would find the tenements that were actually owned. A lot of them were owned by the Astors, who were the incredibly wealthy family at the top end of town, and they were shoving people into these, what they call rookeries, down around Hester Street and Orchard Street and all the famous places now in Soho that we think are cool, weren't so cool back then. And so, yes, once I got that line of thought, I always like to have a central line of thought through a story, and the contradictions were pretty clear in that it was a time of great invention. It was the crucible of world progress, New York at the time. So I thought it was worth, from a philosophical point of view, exploring those contradictions because they still exist today.
Tell me about the Henry Street settlement in New York and why it was important.
Settlements were another really interesting backstory to women and women's rights. So in that period of time, not many women were highly, highly educated or went to university, but the ones that did were generally fairly well off. They went to Barnard and Vassar, and they were sent there by their wealthy fathers. Unfortunately, though, when they left university, they had nowhere to go because they couldn't get a job. And if they got married, they certainly wouldn't be working. So it was in these places that women with means and morals tended to gather, because a lot of them were interested in sociology and healthcare. Lillian Wald is a good example of that. The settlement house movement had its roots in London at a place called Toynbee House. And then that model was moved to Chicago, to Hull House. And one of the characters in the story is from Chicago and Hull House, Claudette. And then that's spread into New York. And Lillian was actually a nurse, and she wanted to tend to the sick of the Lower East Side. And there are some fairly graphic academic papers on what some of the nurses found in the Lower East Side. And so what she did was start to school an army of nurses to see to all the poor. This has happened at Henry Street, but she also understood the power of education, and she got together with other women of the same mindset from Chicago and from New York, and worked together with them to educate, also to set up dramatic arts. She put one of the first city playgrounds into New York so children could go outside and have fun, the impoverished children. And it was also these women, especially Florence Kelly, who researched what was going on in the sweatshops, who campaigned to stop children working in sweatshops and to get the poor and the immigrants educated, and so to help rise up all women and all children, really. So that was important to tell that side of the story, because actually some of the very wealthy women, even women like Alva Vanderbilt, who actually was a trailblazer herself in terms of divorcing a rich husband, she ended up supporting the women's movement, being very strong in suffrage, being very strong in settlement houses. So that's another really good example of the evolution of the women's movement.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So wonderful. Now, Ethan's storylines brought to mind stories like The Greatest Showman and even a novel I enjoyed some years ago called Water for Elephants by Sarah Gruen. Stories that explore the dark underside of travelling circuses and the cruelty many of the animals suffered at the hands of unscrupulous operators and handlers. I wanted to ask you if you thought this was still an issue today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is still an issue. I'm not an expert, but I have developed, obviously, I've always loved elephants my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I guess, what drew me to write this story and really filled me with the passion to keep going. But it was interesting in terms of telling Topsy's story, and I know this is a podcast that you can't see, but here's a whole book on Topsy by Michael Daly, which is a wonderful expose on the mistreatment of animals. Anyway, sometimes when you've got an idea like this, information comes to you like iron filings to a magnet. You know, your radar's up and things just start coming at you every which way. And I found a film called Love and Bananas on Films for Change, and went and saw that with my family. And it was telling the story of an old elephant in Thailand being rescued from captivity by a woman called Lek Chalert. I probably said her name wrong too, but she's part of the Trunks Up Foundation. That foundation actually sheds light on elephants that have been in captivity, elephants that have been mistreated. Unfortunately, elephants are starving at the moment in Thailand because the ones that have been used for tourist rides, which please don't ride elephants if anyone is thinking of it, they no longer have the tourism or the work to feed the animals. So Lek's really busy at the moment saving them. So and I gather there's still circuses and places, zoos, particularly around the world, that don't treat their elephants well. So it is a massive problem still. It breaks my heart because they're sentient creatures. They have emotions. They are a matriarchal society. The grandmother is the main girl, but all the aunties look after the babies. They love their kids like we love ours, and it's heartbreaking to see what happens and how families are torn apart. There's been some really interesting things come up recently, like there's an elephant in the Bronx Zoo called Happy, who's actually not that happy, been isolated. And the New York Supreme Court is hearing a case now that is really about giving her the same rights as a human, which is I haven't been able to get an update on that. And also Cher, the wonderful Cher, has just done a documentary on saving an elephant in Pakistan. And so she's, I guess, with her connection to, she's also into wildlife and helping to conserve wildlife. And that's another example of some of these things and needing to shed light on some of the issues. And it's not necessarily that I set out to shed light on the issue, but the further I've got into it, the more important I believe it is.
Tell me about the title, Tania. Where did it come from?
So the title came from two sources, really. At the beginning of the book, there's a scene about the elephants crossing the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, when the Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883, it was actually called by the newspapers the eighth wonder of the world. Now, in that period of time, just about any marvel of modern engineering was called the eighth wonder. You can understand why, because steel had been invented as a way to keep buildings up. That's when skyscrapers were invented. The Brooklyn Bridge was in itself a marvel of modern engineering. And as we've discussed, Emily Roebling, not many people know that Emily was the engineer who finally finished the bridge. So in some ways it was an eighth wonder for women as well, and that's where Rose got her inspiration from. And as I mentioned, at that time, just about everything was called the eighth wonder. So at the same time that I was researching Topsy and my elephant Daisy at Coney Island, there was also an elephant hotel called the Elephantine Colossus, built in 1885, which was also referred to as the eighth wonder. I guess I'm a serial wonder offender. I really like the idea of wonder. I just thought it was nice for my character to actually pursue her own eighth wonder. What was her own miracle? What was she seeking to do? And that changes throughout the story, obviously, as her character evolves and grows. To me, it was always a very fitting title, but it's not to say I didn't change it 500 times either. So I was conscious that the eighth wonder didn't have the word daughter or girl or secret or mystery in it, and that worried me a little bit, but I felt to be true to the story and the era that I would stick with the eighth wonder. And luckily my publisher liked it too.
Yes, luckily they agreed. Well, I think it's a very fitting title for this wonderful novel. Tania, what would you like readers most to take away from your story?
I guess there's an underlying thought, which is about actions speaking louder than words. I think that's particularly pertinent in this day and age where, we're all guilty of lots of words, but if we turned off our social media for a morning, our actions would be probably more productive. So I think particularly where women are involved, women can actually create their own wonders, and there are lots of men out there prepared to support them too. That's one of the things, is just to pursue your independence, pursue your passion, and let your actions do the talking for you. And then the other one, obviously, is just about remembering that this world it sounds such a platitude and such a cliche, but it's actually a wonderful place, and there are wonders to be found everywhere. It's normally in the smallest of things, that being nature, I suppose, and looking after nature and looking after the incredible animals. I mean, I quite often think, who was the first person ever to see an elephant? I mean, it would have been the most peculiar sight, but yeah, just to look after it and to care for it.
Well said. Tania, you and I have something in common in that we both graduated from the Fiona McIntosh Commercial Fiction Writing Masterclass, albeit in different years.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you how important you thought doing this class was to your writing journey.
I can honestly say I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you without it. It's a whirlwind doing that course, but it was the thing I needed, because I'd promised myself my whole life I would write a book. But as the years slipped by and you get kind of sucked into the vortex of motherhood and full-time work and trying to keep, the balls juggling in the air, the one thing you don't get around to is writing. And so just a quick backstory on this is that I was reading Tanya Blanchard's book, The Girl from Munich, and I was sitting by a pool in Borneo, of all places, having just seen a herd of elephants in the wild, which was amazing. And I was sitting by the pool and I finished the book and I opened to the acknowledgements, and there was Tania writing about Fiona's masterclass. So I raced back to the hotel room with the dodgy Wi-Fi and emailed Fiona post haste. And she got back to me straight away and said, yeah, look, we're full for April, but this is in November 17, but join us in September 18. So I enrolled. And I'd not actually written anything. So I'd, hastily whipped together 10 pages of something really bad. And her comment was, you can write, but your format's awful. And also you need to do your research. That was the other thing, because it was historical. It was absolutely vital, because I learnt about the importance of research, particularly for historical. Yeah. I know it's important for everybody, and I'm not dismissing that for a moment, but to get the authentic facts straight. She's saying, if they're eating a peppermint, what peppermint is it? What's the wrapper? What's the, get down to tin tacks. And every ounce of that authenticity is vital, and I learnt that. I also learned that it's important to have the discipline of trying to write every day, even if it's just fixing up a sentence or something like that, and just to keep going and revisiting and learning and, using your reader's eye when you're going back to edit. I learned so much: character voice, the importance of dialogue, not too many adverbs, not too many cliches.
Yeah.
I mean, lots of great advice. And I think just being in a small, intimate group of people and being able to work on the craft in a safe environment just is, and she's incredibly helpful and incredibly generous with her time. So I definitely would not be sitting here talking to you if I hadn't have done that.
Wonderful words, and I totally agree with you on all points. It was a very eye-opening experience for me as well. Now that you're on the cusp of the release of your debut novel, do you have any tips to offer those who are still seeking publication?
I hope I do. I think I've got tips. So it'll be up to them whether they are or not. My approach with this process was definitely write every day. I suppose there's probably 3 or 4 things. To write as much as you can every day. Secondly, to choose who you share your work with carefully. I didn't share it with many people. I had a good friend read it who was quite brutal with her feedback, but it needed to be. Of course, my mother read it. But then I had someone edit it from a structural point of view. I paid for them to edit it, and I listened to all of her feedback. And I think it is listen to the experts. We all think we know best when it comes to our stories, but actually sometimes we're way too close. And I think that's really important. And just to keep going, keep trying. And yeah, I think that's the thing that I would most recommend is just listen to experts, take their comments on board. Margaret Atwood had a great quote from one of her masterclasses, which is, "The bin is your friend." I think I've churned up but recycled many forests in the finalising of this novel.
Terrific tips. Thank you so much for sharing that, Tania.
My pleasure.
Is there anything you know now that you wish you'd known before you were published?
I mean, it's really everything. I knew nothing. I was just so green, and it's all been a learning experience for me. So is there anything I wished I'd known now? Not really. I've just been kind of embracing everything as it's come along, and maybe the sleepless nights when I'm trying to figure out when my editor said, "Oh, I don't really like the way this is going. Can we just have this scene here?" Maybe the sleepless nights would have been good to know about, but I wouldn't want that to put me off either. So no, I'm just very grateful for the process and for the people that have been involved. And as we talked about before, the incredible support that the writing community, which is lots of women, really do give to each other. It's quite inspiring.
Are you working on something else at the moment?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Can you share anything? I totally understand if you can't. It's all good.
Yeah, no, I have another contract with Penguin. I'm writing another novel now, which is set in 1917 and 1918. So I'm going through, the process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back with the way I write, which is lots of research, lots of writing, and then lots of cutting. And I do it as I go along, which I know not many. When I say that to other people, they go, "Oh, don't do that, keep going." But that's just me. It's the advertising strategist in me, I think, just wanting to just button everything down before I move on. So, yeah, I'm working on that. And after the launch of this novel, I'm actually taking some time to go, hopefully around Australia, COVID depending. We're not sure yet. So for a few months, and hopefully writing at the same time.
Sounds wonderful. Tania, if listeners wanted to learn more about you and your beautiful book, where can they find you?
Instagram at Tania Farrelly _author, and also Facebook just on Tania Farrelly author. And I've got a website too, which is taniafarrelly.com.
Tania, I'm absolutely delighted to have had the chance to chat with you about The Eighth Wonder today. What a gloriously beautiful and inspiring story. I wish you every success. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
It's been an absolute delight, Claudine. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudineteinellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.